So welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for a special presentation here at the Royal. These presentations we do on a regular basis, and they're part of a series called Conversations at the Royal. My name is Nick Downs, and I'm the manager of the Operational Stress Injuries Clinic here at the Royal. And tonight's presentation is part of a special topic called Coping and Healing After Tragic Events, led by two members of the Operational Stress Injuries Clinic as well. And it is with my great pleasure to introduce both members of the Operational Stress Injuries Clinic. We have Nancy Paquin, who's a registered nurse with us, and Danielle Brisbane, who's a registered social worker with us. So I will hand it over to them.
Good evening, my name is Danielle Brisbane. I'm a social worker with the Operational Stress Injuries Clinic, and I work out of the satellite site in Kingston. Tonight, for our presentation, this is what we hope to present on, or this is what we plan to present on. So we're going to discuss what is trauma, some of the common reactions to trauma and traumatic loss, what natural recovery from trauma looks like, when more help might be needed, what you can do to help yourself or others when help is needed, and we'll also discuss some of the support and resources that are available in the community. So we're going to start tonight talking about what is trauma. So trauma is the exposure to actual or threatened death, or serious injury, or also sexual violation. So actual threat or threatened death can include things like an accident, an assault, or torture. And sexual violation is anything from non-consensual touching or inappropriate comments all the way up to what we used to call rape. Exposure can be either direct, as in it happens to you directly. It can be witnessed, as in you saw it happen to somebody else. It can also be from learning about an event that happened to a loved one and learning the details of that event. There's also the category of repetitive exposure to details of an event or several events. This last category is a fairly new addition to the diagnosis, and it was added to take into account the work of people like police, firefighters, paramedics, 911 operators, or emergency room workers who in their career are exposed again and again and again to a series of traumatic events, and over time the accumulation of that exposure may result in PTSD or other traumas, other traumatic disorders. I also want to mention before I click on, an important thing to remember with this is it says exposure to actual or threatened death, but it really has to do with the perception of actual or threatened death. So even if it is found out later that the situation was perfectly safe, if the person perceived their safety to be at risk, that still counts. It's not about the level of threat, it's about the level of perception to a person's safety. Does that make sense? So next I want to talk about some common reactions to trauma. So these are some common reactions that can happen in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event. So we're expecting that these might potentially crop up within about 24 to 72 hours. I say expected because these are so common and so normal that it's really not unusual in any way to see these in anyone after a traumatic event. So the first set of symptoms we're going to talk about is cognitive symptoms. So cognitive refers to thought processes or thoughts themselves. So thought processes are things like concentration or memory, whereas thoughts themselves are the actual content of our thoughts. So some of the cognitive symptoms that can crop up are things like poor concentration, confusion, wondering kind of what's happened, how did this happen, possible feelings of self-blame, which is a way of trying to feel like I had more control over this situation. If I can figure out how it's my fault, it feels like I had more control. Intrusive thoughts about the event, and this can come in the form of thoughts, like a word or a saying, but it can also come in the form of it can come in the form of images. It can also be lines of worrying, such as worrying about losing control, especially because these symptoms can be really disturbing and really bothersome. It can feel like you're starting to lose control, or people might say lose my mind, as well as worry that an event like this will happen again. The emotions that can follow a trauma are things like shock. I can't believe this happened. Did that really happen? What was that? Horror or terror, feeling very scared, fear and anxiety. Anger, irritability, so just feeling very easily upset, very put off by kind of any minor irritant afterwards, because often our stress is at such capacity that it doesn't take much to kind of tip us over the edge and really get under our skin. Feelings of guilt, and guilt can relate to things that maybe you did in the event or would have liked to have done but weren't able to or couldn't find the ability to. Or the fact that maybe you or somebody survived and others didn't. Shame is another, so shame and guilt are often mistaken for each other, but shame refers to the difference between guilt and shame is guilt is I feel like I did something wrong, whereas shame is there's something wrong with me. So it's what's wrong with me, why did I do that, how could I have possibly been there, that kind of thought process. Grief is also very common, as well as sadness or depression, so feeling very low. The other types of symptoms that can come up are behavioral symptoms. So effortful avoidance. And so that is trying to avoid things, people, places that are reminders of the trauma. Withdrawal, so that's pulling back or pulling away from other people or feeling very detached from others as if others can't understand us, or that we don't want to burden others with the distress that we're going through. It can also be, so if we go back to that idea of avoidance can come in another form, which could be the use of alcohol, drugs, or other behaviors that help to either avoid feeling painful emotions or at least numb them. As well as, depending on the type of trauma, checking or vigilance might come up here. And so checking or vigilance is if you're double checking to make sure a situation is safe, double checking to make sure that things are okay. So, for example, in like a home invasion trauma, it would be double checking to make sure the doors are done, double checking to make sure that the alarm is on, and rechecking and making sure everything is okay. And hey, honey, did you check it? And making sure everything is safe. The next set of symptoms are physical symptoms. So physical symptoms, these can show up along with the other symptoms, but sometimes can show up on their own, which makes them feel like even more of a mystery, because it's like, where are these coming from? Why have all of a sudden I'm a little sore than usual? I'm getting all these headaches. So physical symptoms can be poor sleep, so trouble getting to sleep, trouble staying asleep, early waking, and it can or cannot be accompanied by nightmares. And nightmares can be directly the content of the trauma or related content. So sometimes it's looking at themes or feelings that were related to the trauma, but don't actually look like the trauma in the content or the imagery in those nightmares. Early startle response is also another. So that's like jumpiness, like every little noise makes you jump, or you're like, what was that? Changes in appetite, so it could be an increase in appetite or a decrease in appetite after an event. And things like nausea, fatigue, muscle tension, if anybody has like jaw tension or clenches teeth, that kind of thing, and also headaches. So to demonstrate or to kind of describe these, I'm actually going to tell you a personal story about an experience I had with experiencing symptoms like this following a potentially traumatic event. So we're going to go back a few years to when I was doing my master's degree in Thunder Bay, Ontario. Any Lakeheads in here? Other Lakeheaders in here? So I was getting ready for class one morning, and as I'm getting ready for class, I heard this really strange noise. It is January in Thunder Bay, and it is freezing outside, but it sounds like there is a bird outside, and like a really loud bird. So I go to my window and I look out, and I see this woman in the alley beside my apartment building, and it looks like she's convulsing or maybe having a seizure. It's very clear that she's not doing well, that she needs some help. And as she's convulsing, she's moving closer and closer towards the end of the alley. And at the end of the alley is one of the busiest streets in Thunder Bay. So it's looking like this situation is getting less and less safe all the time. So I quickly pick up the phone, I call 911, I ask for a paramedic, I grab my first aid kit and I grab a blanket and I tear downstairs. And as I get outside, my neighbor had actually got there first. So my neighbor came up to me and approached me and he said, okay, this is what we know so far. He said, what's happened is the woman's boyfriend tried to attack her. So she jumped out the third floor window and has hurt herself. She seems to have a head injury. That seems to be why she's moving like this. So he's explaining this is what's happened. The boyfriend had come out and had been kind of yelling at the woman saying, don't say anything, don't say anything. And so my neighbor, who was a really big, strong, burly guy, he and a few other guys had kind of backed him off. But he's saying, the woman won't let a man anywhere near her. Would you mind checking on her? And I was like, yep, that's what I'm here for. Let's go. So I walk up to the woman to check on her, and I see that she actually has a fairly gruesome facial injury. So at that moment, I am very well trained in first aid, by the way, at this point in my life. And at that moment, I'm like, I don't think we covered this. So I turn to what I can do, which is I give her a blanket. I say, it's okay, ambulance is coming. And I use my talking because, I'm a social worker. Talk is my thing versus gauze. So I talk to her, get her calm. I can hear the ambulance. It's very close. So I'm like, okay, even though I can't remember what to do, I think we're going to be okay. So ambulance comes, takes good care of her. And I will tell you the end of that part of the story, just in case anybody's worried about her. She actually ended up being okay. She came back to her apartment building about 3 days later, and she had a sore back, but she was doing okay. So that's the happy ending. But I'll tell you about kind of what went on for me after that. So I'm thinking, okay, she's taken care of, EMS has got her. So I go back in, grab my books, and I head off to class. So I get to class, and it's fine, I'm in class. I'm not really paying as good of attention as I usually do, but I'm trying. But every few minutes, all of a sudden, this image of this woman's face keeps popping into my mind. And what it does, it's quite startling, and it takes my breath away. And as I said, I'm not a nurse. This facial injury was pretty gruesome. And I felt this really strong sense of disgust every time this happened. I'm like, whew. Hey. So I go about my day, and this happens several more times throughout the day. In the same way, I'm not necessarily thinking about it. I might be trying to concentrate on the lecture that's going on, or my reading, or what have you, and this woman's face pops into my mind. So I go about the day like this, and it's feeling a little bit unsettling, and I finally get back to my apartment that night, and thinking to myself, I'm like, gosh, I really hope that this does not keep up tomorrow, because this is not feeling good. So I go to bed that night, and I have nightmares all night long of this same, and it's just that one picture. It's just the face. And but I know what's going on. I'm like, okay. And I wake up the next day, and the next day I notice, like, as the morning gets on, I'm like, this has not happened. And we get through all the next day without it happening, and we're okay after that. So I recovered. I was able to naturally recover within that first day. And what I credit to that is because I happened to be studying trauma as part of my master's degree. So even when all this was going on, I had a pretty good idea of what it was. I knew it was normal. It was definitely not pleasant, but I knew it was normal. And that night when I went to bed, I was just hoping that I'm like, okay, it usually goes away in about 72 hours. Okay, hopefully we'll be okay after a good night's sleep. Unfortunately, I was. The reason I bring this up is A, to illustrate what some of these symptoms can look like, but also to provide you with that information. So if you're not here because of a specific trauma necessarily tonight, because the stats say about 76.1% of all Canadians will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime, if you haven't experienced one, I'm hoping by telling you this information tonight, you'll have it in your back pocket, so that if you or anybody else should ever go through this yourself, you'll know this information, and you'll know, like I did that day, that this is normal, it's okay, and for the most part, you'll find that you'll naturally recover. Now, we are going to talk about what happens when we don't naturally recover, but store this information in your back pocket so that hopefully, should something like this ever happen to you, you'll be able to coach yourself through the day. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about, so this is the other thing I should mention. So I'm going to pause here for a second. I also want to mention this. So I've talked about how it's very, very normal to experience some distress symptoms in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event. I also want to point out that it's very normal. It's normal not to. It's okay not to. Years ago, when they would do traumatic stress debriefings, they would talk about all these symptoms that can happen after a trauma. But it left people feeling like, okay, I don't have those symptoms. Is there something wrong with me? Should I have them? Okay, how do I make myself have these? And people would feel that they were abnormal because they didn't have these traumatic symptoms. So if you've been through a trauma and you don't have the symptoms, that's okay too. Whether you do or you don't, both are okay. The other thing that might happen for some folks is they might not have the traumatic symptoms right away, but they may experience them down the road, whether a delayed effect or after another trauma. So just know it is possible they might crop up later. That's okay. That's okay too. But also know that if you're not experiencing traumatic symptoms, don't worry. That's fine. You're not. There's nothing wrong with you. So I talked about natural recovery, and for the most part, so again, I'm going to go back to that 76.1%, because I love stats. You all heard that I did a fancy degree. We love stats. So 76.1% of Canadians will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. But most will not develop a traumatic stress disorder, because most will naturally recover. So what we expect from natural recovery is that you'll start to feel better within about 72 hours after an event, and really start to see a decrease in symptoms after about 30 days, with full, nearly complete decrease in symptoms after about 1 full year. So I take you back to that woman that I told you about. As I tell you that story, I can still picture her face clear in my mind. I could probably describe her for like a police picture if they ever required it of me, and it's been like 10-something years. So I can still remember that very clearly, but otherwise it doesn't bother me. So hoping within about 30 days, most natural recovery fully occurs within the first year, and recovery is associated with reestablishing previous activities. So this means you're going back to your pre-trauma functioning. That's essentially recovery. Okay? Now, if we don't naturally recover, this is when we start to talk about possible traumatic stress disorders. So the most well-known one, of course, is PTSD. So this is a slide about the prevalence of PTSD. So I said 76.1% of Canadians will go through trauma, but only 9.2% of Canadians will experience PTSD in their lifetime. And in any given month in Canada, about 2.4% of the population has active PTSD. So it shows you that you can go through a trauma and naturally recover. Only a small percentage of the population ends up with PTSD. However, let's talk about how that can happen, what causes PTSD in some cases. This is where I need my notes. So as I prepped for this presentation, I also ran across a really interesting stat that I'll share with you. Is out of 26 countries studied, Canada actually has the highest rate of PTSD in the world. I thought that was a really interesting stat, and there's a couple of reasons that they speculate for that, which is partially diagnostics and how we do diagnostics here, and we're able to catch more folks that might be struggling, but it also has to do with assumptions, and that's the slide I'm going to talk to you about next. So whether or not we naturally recover from a traumatic event has a lot to do with how we make sense of the event after the trauma. So essentially we go through life with these assumptions, and these assumptions are what our lives run on. And I got this nice slide up here. So these are assumptions about how life works, how it's supposed to go, how safe our world is, our beliefs and expectations of how we should treat one another, and also our beliefs about our own capability and our goodness as people. When a traumatic event comes in, it starts to disrupt some of these assumptions. It can really disrupt some of these assumptions that we have about ourselves and the world. Whether it disrupts one, all of them, it really can jam in there and really start to kind of cause us to question how the world works and what's going on around us. This is where one of the speculations from that stat about Canada having the highest has a lot to do with Canadian society. We're a pretty safe country. Generally, we're pretty known for being good, polite people. So we expect that we're going to treat each other fairly well. And we also tend to be a fairly capable, good people. We're very resilient. So when a traumatic event happens, it really causes us to question some of these things. So the example I'm going to use about kind of how assumptions work in our lives is I'm actually going to use that bus crash that happened here about 6 weeks ago. And that event was kind of what spurred on this lecture tonight. And so I'm going to use that as an example. So we have assumptions, we make assumptions every day. So I'm sure many people that were involved in that, they made assumptions that day, which is I'm going to get up, I'm going to get ready for work, I'm going to get on the bus, I'm going to take the bus, and I'm going to go to my job, do the work thing, get back on the bus at the end of the day, head home, and go about my business. Most of us got up this morning and made a similar set of assumptions. Unfortunately, on that day, what happened is something got in the way of those assumptions. There was a crash. And of course, when our assumptions get disrupted like that, it feels awful. This is not what's supposed to happen. This feels terrible. This isn't right. And that can cause a lot of confusion. It can cause, again, a lot of those symptoms that we talked about in that previous slide. Now, what can happen is, in the first little while, we might kind of have to sort out our beliefs and sort out our thoughts around that. If we adapt, we start to think about, okay, This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't good. But I've taken that bus many, many times. I've used OC Transport many, many times. Nothing's ever happened before. Doesn't feel okay right now. But it's probably an accident. It's probably, very unlikely to happen again. Think I might need a couple days off from the bus. But you know what? Next week I'll get back on that thing. Another belief might come up around, okay, that wasn't supposed to happen. And this would be one that could get more stuck. That wasn't supposed to happen. That doesn't feel safe. I'm not sure if I can trust the transit system again. I don't know if I can be safe on transit. Maybe I'm not going to take the bus anymore. Maybe I should walk, or coming up with another way. And so that is where, depending on the beliefs that we produce after a trauma, depends on how we behave after a trauma. And that can create some impediments to natural recovery. So impediments to natural recovery. So ongoing avoidance is one of them. So avoiding things, again, reminders, people, places, things that are reminders of the trauma. Or, if not completely avoiding, it can be doing things to try to feel extra safe or be extra safe. So if I go back to that bus example, maybe it's getting up really early in the morning so that a person's, you're getting on a bus that's not busy at all. Or walking a few extra blocks so you can get on a bus on a different route. Or somehow changing how you're living your life in order to try to feel a bit safer. Other things that can happen that can get in the way of natural recovery is trying to push away thoughts. So when those thoughts come up about an event that happened, trying to push them away, going, you know what, this is too distressing, I don't want to think about this, this really gets under my skin, I'm just going to not think about this. And people come up with lots of creative ways to not think about it. So it can be things like distraction, so I'm just going to get super busy, and as long as I'm busy enough, I'll never think about it. It can be things like, I'm going to skip one here. It can be things like using drugs or alcohol to, again, numb or to block out that memory. And lots of other creative ways that we can try to avoid thinking about it. Get really uncomfortable if somebody's talking about it. I don't know how many people I made uncomfortable in their seats tonight when I chose to talk about it. So we talk about avoidance, and there's actually kind of a phenomenon that's almost the opposite of avoidance, which is, they call it ruminating. This is like a fancy word that means think about it over and over and over and over again. And so it's, again, thinking on that topic repeatedly, which can also leave us feeling very anxious, very worried, and often leads us to come up with some pretty extreme or probably not very helpful ideas about things. Other behaviors you might see are vigilance. So again, checking for signs of threat. The challenge with vigilance is we already have a really good threat detection system built into our bodies. When we get hypervigilant, we're starting to look for threats everywhere. And it kind of becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is, if I'm looking for them everywhere, I'm going to start to think I see them everywhere. They might not actually be there, but it starts to feel like they are, and things start to feel like they're more dangerous. I'd already popped ahead to that alcohol or drug or medication misuse. And then the other thing that might happen is giving up on enjoyable activities. So it's feeling very blah after an event, feeling kind of detached. It might be getting away from more enjoyable activities. And that unfortunately becomes a bit of a cycle, which is, if you're not doing anything fun, you don't have a lot of fun in your life, you start to feel more and more down, right? And so that becomes kind of a downward incline if we start to give those up. I'm going to pop it to the beginning because I skipped this a little bit when I was talking about avoidance earlier. So the reason why avoidance is so problematic after a traumatic event is when we avoid that thing, as long as it's an objectively safe thing, by the way, I don't want you if you're in a dangerous situation and something dangerous happened, don't go back to the dangerous situation to try to not avoid. That's not good. But if it's an objectively safe or typically safe situation, being able to go back is a good thing. What happens is if we avoid a situation that's objectively safe because it was unsafe for a moment in time or feels unsafe, is our brains start to truly believe that that situation is not good for us, it's not safe, we can't go there. And it keeps us from learning that it actually is okay. Does that make sense? So it gets in the way of us being able to learn and being able to overcome that. This is what I think of when I think of like things that my parents said. So I think of things like, get back on the horse. I never rode a horse, but it pretty much meant if I did something and hurt myself, I'm supposed to try again. But that idea of, okay, try it again, see if hopefully it's going to be a different experience this next time. So we talked a little bit about impediments to natural recovery. We talked a little bit about PTSD stats. I'm going to talk a little bit about some additional risk factors that can lead to PTSD for some folks. And so we break these down into 3 categories. We break them down into the before, the during, and the after. So some factors that could be occurring in somebody's life before a trauma that might indicate a higher risk of trauma for that person is a family history or a personal history of mental health issues. Having experienced a previous trauma, so when I thought of doing this presentation about the bus situation, I also thought about that tornado that hit here in Ottawa not that long ago. And I can imagine if somebody's going through both of those things in a matter of 6 months, and I know it was 6 months because that tornado hit during my orientation here, and I am just about 6 months in this job. So it's both within a 6-month period that the world could start to feel pretty unsafe. Can imagine that you could start to feel really uneasy, whether that be in the world in general or just in Ottawa. But having those trauma experiences, especially that close together, could be a little unsettling for some. Also, if anybody's had a difficulty with adjusting to big stress in the past, it can make it much more difficult to adjust to a traumatic stress. So things that can happen during a trauma that make it more likely that somebody would have PTSD afterwards are perceived threats to life. So if you perceive that your life is in danger, that much more increases the likelihood that you might have PTSD afterwards. If the intensity of emotions during that event, particularly your emotions, were very high, it's more likely that you might have a post-traumatic stress reaction after. And the other one is dissociation. Now, this is a very clinical term of dissociation, and I won't go into a huge definition of it, but how I like to describe it, or how I've had people that I work with describe it, is it's like checking out or zoning out at that moment. It's like, okay, this is too much for me, and our brain goes, I'm out. The problem with dissociation, you think that in some ways that would be protective. The problem with dissociation is it leaves us without information about that event. So it's very, very hard to make sense of an event afterwards if we don't know anything about it. Finally, the after. So we've talked about a few different types of trauma today, and there's others that we haven't talked about, and I'm going to bring up one specifically in a second here. But after the event, lack of social support can be a big factor in whether or not somebody develops PTSD. So the Me Too movement has been on a lot of people's minds for the last couple of years. And unfortunately, sexual assault trauma is one where traditionally there has not been great social support. Oftentimes there's victim blaming involved, it's minimized, that kind of thing. And this can happen with all sorts of other traumas too, but this is the one that comes top of mind for me when it comes to lack of social support. And so that lack of social support can leave a person feeling really unsupported, going into things like self-blame or greater fear without that social support. So social support after an event is really important. Other life stressors that are going on for the person at the time can also create a higher risk of PTSD. So if you're already stressed to the max, or become very stressed about other things going on in your life after, it makes it so much harder to have time and capacity and energy to really process what you went through. And finally, the stronger the earlier symptoms are, the more likely it might be that recovery won't occur. Okay. So now I'm going to switch gears a tiny bit, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about traumatic loss. So traumatic loss is the sudden or unexpected violent death of a person. So you didn't see this coming. This just happened. And it's caused by different actions such as an accident or suicide, natural disaster, or another catastrophic event. So this person was right here. They were here yesterday, and now they are gone. How do I make sense of this? So some of the common reactions that can come with traumatic loss are feelings like shock. It is so hard to believe that person's gone. Of course it is. They were right there yesterday. Fear and anxiety, so feeling unsafe oneself, because it brings us so close to death, in such close contact with death, that somebody that we know, it's, oh my gosh, if it happened to them, it could happen to me. or somebody else I care about. So fear and anxiety can come up. Anger is another one that can come up, so feeling out of control, feeling helpless. I also talk about anger and grief is that deep sense of injustice, that deep sense that this was not fair, and becoming very angry, whether that be dispelling it to kind of anybody around you, or just angry at the universe, or if God is something that you believe in, really angry at God for taking this person away. And finally, guilt is another big one that can occur with traumatic loss. So whether that be guilt that you lived and they didn't, if you were at the same, involved in the same trauma, if it's feelings of guilt, like, you know what, the last thing I said to that person wasn't very nice. I really wish I hadn't have said that, or not having a chance to say goodbye. Those can be some common feelings that come up with a traumatic loss. And you'll probably notice that those are not uncommon to just regular grief, but often are felt more intensely with traumatic loss. So this is the last of my slides. And I'm going to use this slide to kind of sum up everything, and I'm also going to ask you to use it if you're here because you've been through a traumatic event yourself, or you know somebody really close to you that's been through a traumatic event. I'm going to ask you to use it as a tool to possibly assess yourself or assess somebody in your life. So I borrowed this slide from the Department of National Defense and their Road to Mental Readiness material. They use this material to brief military members ahead of deployment and ahead of leadership positions to be able to detect mental health issues in themselves or their troops. So what you're going to notice here is we've got 4 categories. So healthy, reacting, injured, and ill. So healthy is where we ultimately want to be. That's where we want to be most of the time. Reacting is in response to an event. Now, reacting is something I would expect, whether it be a traumatic event or just a lot of life stress. We can all get to reacting just from day-to-day stress even. Work's really busy lately, or the kids are acting up, or mother-in-law's coming into town, that kind of thing. We can get to reacting. The others, when we get down to injured or ill, that's where we start to say that, we start to think, you know what, there might be cause for concern there, and you might need a little bit of extra support. Now you'll notice underneath those categories, healthy, reacting, injured, and ill, there's a nice arrow, and the arrow goes both ways. This arrow goes both ways for a good reason. Yes, our symptoms can decline, but we can also get better as well. We can come back the other way. So when we look at that screen there, we look under healthy, so I know this is a really overwhelming slide, so I'm going to kind of break it down into how I think about it, or the categories I think about. So the top line there, it talks about mood. So when we're doing well, when we're healthy, our moods are good, we're feeling okay. Next part is about attitude or sense of humor. So our attitude is good, our sense of humor is on check. P is about performance, so we're performing well at work, hopefully performing well at home. Next is around sleep or physical health issues. So our sleep is still, when we're healthy and we're good, our sleep is still good. Our physical health is good for what our version of physical health, or our physical health is good. We're engaged in our usual social activities and physical activities. And finally, we're using, if we use alcohol, we're using it responsibly. If you use cannabis, you're using it responsibly. If you like things like gambling, or you enjoy watching pornography or engaging in sexual activity, you're doing those within your normal parameters in a healthy, safe way. As we start to move down the continuum, so my left, your right, down the continuum, you're going to see changes in those things. In reacting, you might see some slight fluctuations. You might be grumpier than usual, maybe a little less energy. Sense of humor might get a little bit on the dark side, but you're still doing okay. When you start to hit, my trainer, I don't think he's in the room, but my trainer called it the yellorange, which is when you hit that line between yellow and orange, that's when you start to kind of go, ooh, might need a little hand. And this is where mood is really starting to go downhill, whether that be you're getting grumpier, or angry, hard to be around, or feeling sad, feeling more anxious. Humor is starting to get less appropriate and going all the way down. Sleep is getting more disturbed, nightmares, that kind of thing. And moving down to that alcohol and drug use, not using more alcohol than usual or more cannabis than usual, or maybe engaging in harder drugs if that's something you do. Even using medications inappropriately, whether that be prescribed medications like narcotics or pain medications, or over-the-counter medication. So using things like Gravol or I'm thinking Tylenol PM to an excessive amount that might not be safe, that's when you start to go, oh, okay, we might start to worry. So when you hit that yellow, that orange or red category, that's the point when I want you to think about getting some help, especially if this has lasted more than a few weeks to a month, if the symptoms are really intense, and if it's getting in the way of your usual day-to-day functioning. That can be turning to a social support network, or it can be turning to professionals. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to talk to you about some of the options that you're going to have if you're finding yourself in that orange to red range and that you need a little bit more help. Thank you.
So I wanted to talk to you about what can you do. I wanted to talk to you about the psychosocial facets of resilience. Resilience is broadly defined as adaptive characteristics of an individual to cope and recover from adversity. So I'm going to talk to each of the bubbles that are up there. The first one at the top, embracing a personal moral compass. It's about maintaining relatively positive core beliefs, results in more adaptive thinking in the face of negative life events. The next one is about active coping skills, and I wanted to tie them in across from the resilience to maintaining a social support network because they're very closely linked. As a factor promoting resiliency, it incorporates cognitive and behavioral components. Resilient individuals use active rather than passive coping skills. They act and create their own resilience and active effort to seek the help and support of others, comprise the behavioral or action-oriented components. Very few of us can go it alone, and interviews that were done in this study with resilient individuals often yield acknowledgement of invaluable social support. Considerable emotional strength accrues from close relationships with people and even with organizations. And the perception of an available safety net can enable one to act in one's own interest when confronting or recovering from stressful or traumatic situations. The next one is cognitive flexibility. And this refers to the ability to reappraise one's perception and experience of a traumatic situation instead of being rigid in one's perception. Optimism. It refers to the maintenance of positive expectancies for important future outcomes. And finally, physical activity. This is another factor that is primarily behavioral in nature. Attending to one's own physical well-being before, during, and after facing stress or trauma can promote resilience. So we want to create meaning. So in the early aftermath, this can be very difficult to even imagine. A tragic event can lead us doubting our purpose or question meaning in life. It isn't useful to try to find a positive interpretation of the event itself. In time, it can help to find personal meaning from a loss and create a positive legacy. Ways to make the world a better place, refocusing on values and meaningful activity, and not taking people or things for granted. So we wanted to also review with you how to help yourself or someone you care about. So some of the do's that you can do. The do's you can do. Listen. Be available consistently. Understand and normalize common trauma reactions. Accept initial coping. Most anything goes in the first few days. Encourage use of natural supports over therapy, and limit exposure to media accounts. Don't minimize saying to someone that it'll be okay, and if it was a traumatic loss of a human life, that they're now in a better place. To try to take control of their well-being. Don't give advice don't judge, and don't personalize reactions. So when to consider more support? So when post-traumatic stress occurs, when we start to organize our lives around the trauma, which is what Danielle had touched on. If the duration is more than 1 month, and it happens most of the time, the intensity, so the distress, anxiety, sadness, grief, and shame is significant. And the impairment is affecting relationships, activities, work, and self-care. So the exceptions of when to seek help right away are when there's thoughts of harming oneself or someone else, excessive alcohol or drug use, dangerous or risky behaviors, and the inability to care for oneself or dependents. So to access the resources, it's natural supports. So we're looking at family, friends, coworkers, clergy, community groups if relevant. The EAP or Employee Assistance Program, registered mental health professionals. So you can check on college websites for information about psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers. And there's family services in Ottawa. Immediate needs would be calling 911 or the emergency department at your local hospital, the mental health crisis line. Ottawa and the counties of Prescott, Russell, Renfrew, Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry, Leeds and Grenville District, Pembroke Regional Hospital Mobile Crisis Team, the Youth Services Bureau, the Crisis Line, the Ottawa Distress Centre, to name a few. But there is an app for that. There's 3 here on this slide that I wanted to talk to you in more detail. So the first one is OSI Connect app. This was developed at the Royal in partnership with Veterans Affairs Canada. It is full of helpful tools such as self-assessments, videos, and people telling their own stories and recovery of OSIs, which are operational stress injuries. It provides advice for families and loved ones of people with an OSI, self-care strategies, and resources for healthcare providers. The PTSD Coach Canada app can help you learn about and manage symptoms that can occur after trauma. These features include reliable information on PTSD and treatments that work, tools for screening and tracking your symptoms, convenient, easy-to-use tools to help you handle stress symptoms, direct links to help support and get you the help you need. And it's always there when you need it. The Virtual Hope Box is a multimedia coping skill app designed for individuals struggling with depression, particularly for military service members. The 4 main features of Virtual Hope Box include sections for distraction, inspiration, relaxation, and coping skill options. 2 other really good apps that I wanted to share are Headspace, and you can learn to meditate and live mindfully. It features hundreds of themed sessions on everything from stress and sleep to focus and anxiety. They're bite-sized guided meditations for busy schedules, and they also have SOS exercises in case of sudden meltdowns. R2MR is Road to Mental Readiness. It's a mobile app and a training tool developed to improve short-term performance and long-term mental health goals, while providing tools and resources required to manage and support Canadian Armed Forces members, family members, and the general public. So this concludes our presentation, and I wanted to share this quote with you from Michelle Rosenthal. Trauma creates change you don't choose. Healing creates change you do choose. Thank you very much for attending.